Hey everybody, Phil Kerner here, the Tool and Die Guy, and welcome to lesson number 265, Getting Started with EDM. And I'm really excited about this class because I would tell you that EDM was one of the things that really made my career as a toolmaker really take off because of the creativity and the things that are involved with running an EDM machine. Really use all of your math skills, your creativity skills. So let's get started here. So let's look at a few EDM machines. Now, I understand a few people have said, really the trade's really changed. They're all CNC EDMs, but you know as well as I do, learning how to run a manual machine before you run a CNC machine is usually the best thing to do. Number two, I really know who my subscribers are, and most of them are small shops, garage shops, and hobbyists who really would probably end up buying something like this. And I would tell you right there, that Excello EDM, man, that's what we're going to use for a lesson. They're awesome. This is another nice little EDM. It's a Charme. You can pronounce it everywhere that want to. It's a Charme, made in Switzerland, desktop model. Nice machine, kind of small. And of course, if you've got several $100,000 to spend, you can get yourself a Agi and go completely CNC. So we're not going to get into that, but that's, as anything else in trade, they've managed to make everything in the trade CNC based, right? So let's get started with EDM, and that EDM is electrical discharge machining. And what do we use EDM machines for? Well, in most cases, it's used for forming blind female features and molds and dies. As you know, if you're going to do a male feature like a pin or a punch or a core, you can machine that milling and grinding and all the things you can do externally. And here's a good example of an injection molded part with a lot of female features. Now this is the actual part. So all these ribs you see here and these gussets and these fine rib that goes around the whole part that mates into this part, that would have all been EDM because they're all square corners. They're probably, maybe 30, 40 thousandths at the tip, plus 1 degree or so draft to get it out of the mold. Look at all these gusset ribs that are sharp at the corners. Those would all be female features in the mold to make a male feature in the part. So EDM, you have to learn to be a little dyslexic, but that's the way it works. So EDM is used to machine complex shapes into molds and dies. So the way that's done is through the use of electrodes. And we're going to get way more into this as the series progresses, but graphite is going to be your medium. Graphite is how you're going to, 90% of the time, 99% of the time, if you're a small shop owner, that's how you're going to form your male shapes to erode into your steel. And as you can see, the big thing you're going to need here is a lot of electrode holders, and we'll get into that. Here's another big electrode, obviously to mill or burn away a very shallow rib, and you can see some wear on the electrode. You need to usually make at least 4 electrodes because there's wear on the graphite, but that's a big chunk of graphite that was mounted in to burn a round female feature into a piece of steel. Moving along here, again, some more electrodes. And why so many? Because depending on how many, one electrode usually doesn't finish the job. It never does. Standard rule of thumb is now maybe a little less with the CNCs, but back in the day, you made 4 electrodes. Rougher, semi, and finish. They wear away. The graphite wears away. And anybody who does a lot of EDM machining will usually have several skids worth of used carbon laying around. My personal experience with EDM is in the injection mold building process. That's what I was trained as a mold maker, and here's a good example of what that looks like. Here's a clear plastic part, and look at all these ribs, these gusset ribs with these angles on there. Well, that would all have had to be machined into the steel. Well, how are you going to get these sharp corners with an end mill going at 45 degrees? It's not going to happen unless you inserted all of this, which would be quite the process. And here's a good example for you. That's the electrode that's going to go in and rebuild this this particular mold. And the only thing that's missing is, if you look here, you can see that there's an angle running up there. They need to grind that angle on these electrodes. So there you go. There's a piece of graphite that's ready to go to rebuild a mold or make a new mold to machine these gusset ribs in. And I would tell you, in my experience, most of the time we were doing what we would call burning, when you have to burn something, kind of the nomenclature of the trade. We don't say we need to EDM something, we say we need to burn something. And that's electrode ready to go, and there's probably at least 3 or 4 more behind this, depending on how many cavities you have to burn. But we'll get into that during the class. But that's a piece of graphite ready to go and machine these gusset ribs into the steel. So let's talk about the advantages of the EDM process. Hardness of material doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's 75 Rockwell or 30 Rockwell. It's EDM, it erodes the material beautifully. That's not a problem. And it's very accurate, and you can form fine details unable to machine any other way. Those, in my opinion, are the top 3. I'm sure there will be others that will come up during this class, but those are 3 that came to mind right away. Disadvantages of EDM: very slow process. Even with the advantages of the CNC EDMs now, they're still slow. You'd rather figure out some other way to do it. You just don't EDM stuff because you feel like doing it. You do it because it's kind of a last resort. Now, number 2, it's dirty, and it's dirty. Did I say dirty? It is dirty due to the graphite machining and the oil involved. And we'll talk more about that later, but rest assured, working with graphite is a mess. And number 3, it can be difficult to polish the surfaces, as the EDM process can form a little hardened surface due to the heat. Anytime you introduce heat to steel or a material, it does put a glaze of a certain hardness on it. So now you've got a slightly pitted feature from the EDM process, and you can make sure you adjust your electrodes to finish finer and finer, but that takes longer and longer. So it's always a catch-22. Again, we'll get more into that in the class, but it can be difficult to get the EDM pits out of your work. Now back to the dirty thing. If you want to spend a couple $100,000 and get yourself a CNC machine that's completely enclosed like a refrigerator door, that's great. You better be machining a lot of electrodes. Most guys can't afford that. So when you start doing this stuff, if you have to mill some electrodes because of their size or their shape, you're going to make a giant mess. Milling electrodes is a big deal. Throws a lot of dust throughout the shop. You'll all of a sudden go to change the fluorescent lights in the front office 500 feet away, and when you move the ceiling tiles, dust falls out, black dust. EDM makes a mess, and that's why a lot of shops won't buy one. We could use one where we are at work, and I know they won't do it because they just don't want to deal with the graphite, and that's a good conclusion. And then another thing, when you're grinding, you can buy these hoods for your grinders with a sucker system, and they enclose most of the wheel. Now, this is a plastic one, which means it would have to be dedicated to EDM or graphite grinding, because if you started grinding steel on this one, the sparks would melt this thing. But you can buy a cheaper one, and there's another one called a vacuum guard. It's about $300, where you'll be able to grind both steel and carbon with it. But you need a vacuum system in your grinding room, or if you start grinding graphite without a hood, you're going to make a real mess. I can tell you that. So I don't want to harp on the messes the EDM makes, but let me tell you, that process generates enough dust and oil that a lot of shops won't own that machine. So the EDM process, okay, I like to talk about it as being welding in reverse. And here we have some stick welding going on, and it's very similar. We have an electrode, but in this case, we're adding material to the part. The insulator is the air around it, and the coating on the electrode. In the EDM process, it's quite similar, except we're eroding material. And when we erode material, we have an electrode that 90% of the time moves up and down to erode the shape into the workpiece, submersed in this oil we call dielectric fluid. Like welding, you've got your surfaces grounded, negative and positive, and to connect the circuit. So that part is pretty simple, and you can see a gap around here. There's always a gap, and we call that overburn. As the electrode goes down, depending on your EDM settings, it's going to do make something called overburn. So if you want this little slot here in this particular drawing to be 1 inch wide, you would not make your electrode 1 inch wide also. You would allow for overburn. And there are calculations for that, but in most machines, especially the old manual ones, unless you're really going to turn up the heat, you allow 2 thousandths per side overburn. So if this is going to be a 1 by 1 square hole in a surface, you would make your electrode 0.996 by 0.996, 996 thousandths by 996 thousandths, allowing 2 thousandths per side overburn for a finished cut. And again, we're going to get way more into this as the series moves along. There'll be much more to come regarding the actual operation of the EDM machine. The next lesson will focus on getting your work area set up with everything you'll need to begin the EDM process. And there's a lot of things we need to talk about. Just little things you'll need you'll be surprised. You know, it's always funny. People think I'm going to buy a Bridgeport and I can run, you know, I can mill. Well, guess what? All of a sudden you need a sign plate, you need cutters, you need collets. There's always, you know, nothing's for free, isn't it? And for you guys that have set up your own home shops, you know, whatever machine you buy a grinder, well, all of a sudden you're buying sign plates and grinding wheels and wheel dressers. Every process has their set of tools, and EDM, which is going to be fun to share with you guys, has a lot of little secrets, and I'm excited to get this one out there. This has been in my heart for the last few years. I knew this was going to be a big series, and EDM, it to me was the most fascinating, creative process in the whole tool and die making career I had. So we'll pass this information along. We'll get started on video number 2 in the series shortly about the stuff you need, and we'll see you on the next video.